My name's Jonathan. I'm a senior product manager at Reddit, where I head up our advertiser success team. And today I'll be giving a presentation on some practical tips for building PM skills. So before we dive into the content of the presentation, I wanted to just give a quick summary of like what this presentation is and also what it isn't. So the content here is really geared toward junior PMs and people who are looking to break into product management. And my goal here is to kind of give you practical exercises that you can use to build skills. This isn't meant to be kind of a comprehensive, overview of all PM skills, but the idea is to give a starting point for people to start practicing some core skills. And I think ultimately practicing these skills should do two things. It should make you a better PM, obviously, but I think it will also give you some ammunition, substance for you to talk either in your interviews or while you're networking with other product folks. So just wanted to kind of set that at the outset, level set with everybody to frame kind of what I'm, what I'm presenting. In this presentation, basically, I'll focus on three primary skill areas that I think there's kind of like practical handles that you can go and practice on. The first is product sense. The second will be execution. And the third will be business metrics. And you can tell that I did these slides at 2 a.m. because I have a typo on my third slide, but we'll just keep going. First is product sense. Product sense comes up a ton, right? PMs talk a ton about what product sense, and it's this kind of nebulous thing that's difficult to define. But for me, I think four qualities that really are essential for developing good product sense are having curiosity, being observant, having empathy, and being able to intentionally reflect on your experiences and experiences of others. And so like to kind of just like, give a background, right? Like, what do we mean when we say product sense? I think I really like Julie Zhuo's really succinct definition. She's the former VP of product design at Facebook and a great kind of just general thought leader on all things product. She used the term product thinking, but I think it's kind of the same thing. Her definition, which I'll just quote here, says, do you have good instincts about what makes a product useful and well-loved by people? And more than that, can you design towards that outcome? And I think that kind of sums it up pretty neatly, which is, when you're interviewing for PMs, looking for PMs, that's kind of one of the first things you look for is, can this person kind of just have the instinct to determine like, hey, what makes a product tick? Is it going to be successful? What makes it useful? Why do people love it? And then can you replicate that? Can you also design a product to achieve those kind of same outcomes or have to embody those same qualities? So I think my first big tip around how to get good at how to develop your product sense is really just to think intentionally about your own product usage, which I think a lot of people hopefully already do. But I think, if you really double down on it and block out time to make that happen, I think you'll really kind of, supercharge or kind of accelerate the growth, of your product sense. And so when I say like thinking intentionally, kind of like a simple exercise for that would be, just ask yourself on a very regular basis, whether it's daily or weekly, you just sit on like, what products do I love and use and why? And then conversely, you can ask yourself, which products do I avoid using and which ones do I dislike? And I think the key would be, after you do that, write that down, right? Do your best job to articulate to yourself what makes a product work for you. And then from there, you can kind of hypothesize, like, what possibly makes it work for others as well? And if you can, I would encourage you, like, keep a notebook with notes and observation that you can build up over time. And later you can go back and you can reflect on those past observations. And so, like, for example, I recently wrote several pages for myself on why I find Clubhouse super addicting, which I think, obviously you all are here, so you might feel the same way. And so I just kind of jotted down like a ton of notes on like, hey, little things and big things I felt they did right that made it a really compelling experience. And then I shared it with my peers for feedback. And I think that last part is super critical because, once you share it out, you'll realize there are some really common threads that people also share in your experience, but there are also going to be some very different perspectives. And I think that will give you a really solid handle on kind of digging in on like, hey, like, where can you refine your product sense? Where are things that you haven't considered that you should think more about? And then kind of how can you broaden your understanding and empathy for different types of users and different usages of a given product. So I think that's kind of like, where I would start. Like, that's kind of like a baseline, right? Like, think really intentionally about what you're already doing on a day-to-day basis and just kind of block out some time to make sure you go document that and then spend time to review it. And I think that's the starting point, like everyone can kind of pick up and run with. And I think, a reminder here is that like when you're doing this, like remember to look past design aesthetics. I think a really critical part of product sense, especially when you're first starting out, is to not confuse aesthetics for good user experience or good product design. One thing you can do here is to ask yourself, like, what products look really cool or seem like really sexy, but don't really have staying power. You don't find yourself using it over and over again, or you don't find yourself actually paying for after like maybe the trial period expires. And I think the other, again, I'm going to provide a lot of converses in my presentation, but the flip side is that you can also ask yourself, what products do you use a ton and get a lot of value out, despite them not actually being that aesthetically pleasing? And I think using those two questions and asking yourself those two things on a regular basis will really help you kind of drive a wedge in between, differentiating what is good product design and what is good user experience and what is simply just good aesthetic. And not to say, obviously a lot of apps do both of those things really well. But I think being able to tease those two things out and separate them in your analysis is a really key part of developing your product sense. Cool. Moving on to tip number 2. I think I touched on this a little bit earlier, but I think another really crucial thing when developing your product sense is to seek out people who have differing product opinions from yourself. The goal here is really to just broaden your scope, broaden your empathy. Most product thinkers will always start from their own experiences, right, to develop their product sense, which is natural and that's normal. It's totally okay. But over time, if you want to be a good product manager and develop products for a lot of people and a broad range of people, which I think is everyone's goal, right? When you get into product management, you want to have that kind of wide impact. You need to necessarily look past your own biases and preferences and kind of absorb many different viewpoints and different perspectives and uses of products. And so like, in terms of a practical exercise, right, like go identify products that other people seem to love and use very frequently, but you just don't get. And then, you can do the opposite where, again, conversely, you can go look for people who don't really appreciate a product or an app that you find super valuable. And then, same as before, spend the time hypothesizing about why that might be. Maybe you're not the target audience, or maybe you're missing something about the core experience of an app that doesn't click for you. And then go validate those assumptions by talking to and interviewing people and taking down some notes. And then you'll realize that as you reflect over those different viewpoints, you'll kind of be able to broaden your scope or your kind of your empathy for different uses of products or different perspectives on products. And I think that's just a good thing to do, generally speaking, is to just kind of like, hey, talk to people who don't think the same way as you and really dig in on like, where do you disagree and why? Is it because, you have different mental models for how a product works? Is it because you have different goals when using products, so on and so forth? And I think, doing that on a regular basis really helps you get out of designing products just simply for yourself and designing products for many different types of users. And then lastly, I think this is kind of like a fairly straightforward, tip. And I think it's one that we all kind of do intuitively, but I think it's just worth mentioning, which is, constantly evaluate new products and features as they come out. Newly launched products and features, I think they're really good, especially to give yourself an opportunity to calibrate your product sense skills. Like when it comes out, just ask yourself, like, do you think this will work? Why or why not? Who do you think the target audience is? What do you think the intended impact outcome of this feature or this product is going to be? And what do you think its ceiling is going to be? And I think, if you want to just kind of like really test yourself, like write down those observations and predictions, compare your notes with, other people on Twitter or like, people, in real life, and then check back, like actually like keep yourself accountable, like look at the trajectory of that feature or that product over the coming weeks, months, or even, years. And then kind of ask yourself, like, what did I get right? What didn't I anticipate? What did I miss in my initial analysis? And I think, again, like if you notice, like in this first section, like this theme of like, making sure you write down your observations and then coming back to reflect on them is really good to help hone that sense. Otherwise, I think a lot of things that you kind of just like your opinions or your feelings about products end up being very kind of like nebulous and just kind of like, oh yeah, I always knew they were going to take off, or yeah, I always knew there's something special about that. Like that kind of like backwards confirmation bias can really hurt you. And I think like really holding yourself accountable to like, hey, like pick a stance on this and why you think it does or doesn't work, and then go back and like test yourself, like like, was I right? Because ultimately that's kind of what as a PM you'll have to do, right? You'll have to make product decisions. And you have to be accountable for whether they work out or not for a company or for a business. Cool. So that's the first section on product sense. The next section we'll talk about execution, which is another, I think, folks are familiar, like huge theme and hugely important skill for PMs to have. And I think when we talk about execution, the kind of like three things I really think about as being super critical for developing execution or being good at execution is really having attention to detail for one, two, being tenacious, and then three, I think, similar to tenacity, I think you could also say following through, making sure you always follow through on a plan, on a proposal, on a promise. And so, before we dive into kind of like, practical handles on like how to develop execution skills, I would say like, in terms of why execution especially in the early stages of your career as a PM, the most important thing is actually your most important job is to ship product. And on the face, that might seem really simple, but execution is one of those kind of like, the devil's in the details types of things. And so when I'm evaluating junior entry level PMs, I'm not looking for like, hey, are they highly strategic? Are they like a product genius? Like I'm actually just asking myself like, hey, can I trust this person to take a small product area or a set of features or a metric and just go ship things and go like make things happen? So I think that's really just the starting point for most PMs. And if you can't execute, it's really hard for you to go, build kind of like more PM skills on top of that and be more effective. It really kind of starts and it ultimately ends with execution. And so, this is pretty simple, but my first tip for building execution skills is actually just to go do it, go execute, build things and ship them. There's really no way around it. And I think that's kind of like not that's an answer I know a lot of people don't like to hear. Probably folks are like, well, I don't know how to code. I can't just go and build and ship things. And to which I would say, it doesn't matter. Like you don't have to know how to code in order to solve problems for customers, experiment with new ideas, or build something that has value. Really, you can build anything. And so, like if you were to just say like Google like no code tools, right? A couple of examples I would just throw out like as a starting point, right? You can mock up an interactive prototype in Figma. Like that's something you can ship and show to people, get them to use, and get feedback on. You could build a website, with no code tools like Webflow. You can automate an existing workflow using something like Zapier. That's a product in its own way, even though it doesn't require you to actually write any code. You could even just write a deck or a doc of like what a product you would want to see, how you want it to work, which, maybe it's not something that people can use, but it's actually like, a good chunk of the work in terms of the product thinking and thinking through every step of actually making it happen. But there are a lot of things you can do to either like deliver something that is usable by people that you can get valuable feedback from, or get pretty close to it. But I think the key point here is just to go and do something, right? Like it's all theoretical and, kind of like when you're just like spitballing and throwing out fun ideas or discussing like what may or may not work. To be able to bridge that gap from like that kind of theoretical ideation to like just trying to make something happen is kind of where a lot of the kind of like the practical day-to-day skills of PMs are built and grown and developed. And so I would encourage, like, if you want to be a PM, right, and you want to build PM skills, you have to go and just do things. You have to go try to make it happen, and you'll learn tons of small kind of like indescribable, like kind of like things that are tough to like articulate or quantify in that process of trying to build that will serve you very well over time. And then after you build something, the next step is really, second tip is really seek feedback and develop a thick skin. The execution is an iterative process. I think everyone knows this, right? You ship, you seek feedback, you iterate, and then you repeat. Shipping is really just the first step. If you don't get the feedback and you don't learn, you don't iterate, you're missing out on a huge chunk of the process. And so just remember, like, no one really gets it right on the first try. You can't, like, I think we all know this, right? You can't just build something and launch it and just like everyone loves it, right? And so don't wait until your work is perfect before showing it and seeking feedback. Honestly, the longer you wait, the more opportunities for learning iteration you're going to miss out on. And so ship early and often, and then get feedback and iterate early and often. Second thing to remember about this is like, it's really useful to develop a thick skin. Product management is a job that requires a low ego in order for you to succeed. The reality is that, when you're starting as a PM, you're going to make bad decisions. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to have terrible ideas. You're going to get it wrong. And you're probably going to do that, quite a few times. And that's not just like in the early stages. That happens like later in your career as well, right? And so the best executors, like, they actively seek feedback and criticism and use it as a way to learn and iterate. They don't worry about their ego. They don't worry about, like, did I get it right? Did I get it wrong? They just worry about, can I get to the right answer by continuously iterating, shipping, learning, and repeating that. And then ultimately over time, what this does is it helps you get good at setting really clear goals. It forces you to think really hard about, your pivots and your changes. It helps you get really comfortable with making difficult trade-offs. And it also helps you ultimately to avoid getting too attached to your early product decisions. And so when you get in that habit of like, hey, ship, get feedback, iterate, then you don't kind of get stuck with like things like, sunk cost, or, getting emotionally attached to like, hey, I made a decision, I really like it. Once you find that something doesn't work, you're just able to kind of like move on and build something that, hopefully works a little better. Okay, cool. Sorry, I'm going at a bit of a frantic pace to make sure I keep this all within time. So the third section is business metrics. And I think with business metrics, the three things I really think about being critical to helping develop, skills around reasoning through business metrics is one is just critical thinking, objectivity, and just structured reasoning, which, I think are relatively kind of like intuitive, things that you would talk about when you start thinking about like, hey, how do I get good at reasoning through business metrics? I know like this title of this section is not like super like clean. Like, what does it mean to be good at business metrics? I would just kind of frame it in the sense of like, hey, fundamentally, the product management role is a business one. And ultimately, PMs are evaluated on their ability to drive business impact. And so understanding and reasoning through business metric is a very key skill for PMs to know how to evaluate, frame and prioritize the product work that they do. And I think that's going to be critical from day one all the way to, kind of however far you go in your PM journey. And so I think, in terms of a practical exercise that you can do to develop, your sense or your ability to reason through business metrics is to, we think about new features or feature ideas to try to assess the impact of those for yourself. And so like, let me just like, to give you an idea, right? Like the most common mistakes I see when I review PM applications is that, a PM will propose a feature, maybe in an interview, maybe in a homework assignment that they submit. And, when they get to the section of like, hey, what metrics or KPIs would you use to kind of evaluate the success of this feature? Usually I will get some variation of like, oh, I would look at how many people click this button or how many people adopt this feature over time, which is fine. Like, I'm not saying you should never measure that. That's certainly an important thing to know and to keep track of when you're building and shipping a new feature. But I think it kind of misses the bigger picture, because ultimately a feature isn't really successful if a lot of people use it. It's successful if it drives a positive business outcome for the company. When you get to like a stage of like a large tech company with a huge audience, right, it's not actually hard to get feature adoption. You can always make a button bigger. You can always send more push notifications. You can always put a feature in, on to more users, right? But ultimately, if that feature doesn't, drive an outcome in a metric that feeds into the company's bottom line, whether it's, purchases, transactions, user retention, whatever, then, it doesn't matter how good your adoption metric looks, right? And so I think that's a good thing to always keep in mind. Next time when you see a new feature, in a product, or you have an idea for a feature, in a product that you use, like take a step back and ask yourself, like, hey, if that company or that product built that feature, right, what impact would it have on the company's business? What metrics would capture that impact in a way that that company or that product would care about? And what do you think that degree of impact would actually make that feature worth investing time and energy to design and go build? And I think if you capture that, if you kind of like catch yourself and like take a step back and ask yourself that question, that set of questions every time you have an idea for something, you'll start kind of like seeing like, oh, like I understand like why maybe that's not prioritized. Or you start to kind of think about like, oh, like how would I actually maybe build that feature in a better way to maximize its business impact? And I think you can actually get a lot better and more refined about your product ideas when you kind of like start getting good at taking that business impact equation into account every time, something you're like, oh, like that's a good UX, or like I would want this feature. I think this feature would be interesting. Another practical tip for kind of getting good with business metrics is to draw metric trees, or sometimes they're called KPI trees. Like I realize like, hey, it's not it's not super easy to just kind of like, out of nowhere, just be like, hey, assess the business metric, business impact of this feature, right? A really practical way to kind of get a handle on that is like, look at the product or the company holistically, and then pick like one or two top line metrics that are like fairly obviously important to the company. Usually this will be something like active users or revenue or number of transactions. And then for each metric, like break it down into components. To give an example, right? Active users is affected by things like new signups and retentions of current users. Revenue will probably be affected by things like conversion rate and the value or size of each purchase or transaction. And then each of those metrics can be further broken down in various ways, right? Like new signups can be, broken up into like, hey, where are these users coming from, and what's the conversion rate of the signup flow? Retention could be broken up a lot of different ways. Conversion rate of transactions can be thought of in different ways as well. But when you start breaking down that metric tree as far as you can possibly go for a given product, then you start realizing like, oh, like what features, what work streams, what teams might map to each metric. And then you can kind of get a sense for like, hey, like they might have a PM that focuses on improving like this specific metric. And then all of a sudden you have a clear path for like how that one PM's work kind of feeds all the way up into the top level of like what this company is going to care about. And so I think that's a really good way to start. And if you feel like stuck on like, hey, I don't know how to get started drawing this metric KPI tree, the first thing you can do is just go read up on a company's financial statements. And then you'll quickly kind of see like, hey, what metrics do they track and report to investors? What metrics do they focus on reporting? Because that will tell you like, what they care about, what they think is driving growth in their company. And by extension, you'll understand like where they're investing their product and engineering resources. For public company, that's pretty straightforward. You just go find their investor relations sites, and then you go read their quarterly or their annual investor presentations. For private companies, it could be a little trickier, but you can kind of just look at what numbers they report, to the press, or you can just look at what their competitors report as a reference point. Just kind of check what space they're in. But I think that's kind of like a good kind of like concrete handle to get into it. If you feel like, hey, I don't know how to just like start from nothing and draw this metric KPI tree. But I guarantee if you just take the exercise of like, hey, for a given product that you're interested in, you just sit down and you try to map that tree out on paper. It will start to become second nature. And then when you think about any product or any company, you read any news report about like someone raising money and like what metrics they reported, or you listen to any quarterly earnings call, you'll start to develop a better sense of like, oh, cool, like this is how they think about the way they structure their bets. This is the way they think about where they're trying to drive growth and what levers they have for making their product or their company grow. And I think the other important thing to keep in mind when drawing metric and KPI trees is that there's usually no like one right answer. There's usually multiple right answers, because every metric can usually be broken down in more ways than one. Kind of like I mentioned earlier, right? Like you could break down kind of like new user acquisition in many ways. You could break it down by like channel, but you could also break it down by flow and conversion rate. And you could frame it in a lot of different ways. And kind of like once you start exploring different ways to break down a single part of a metric tree or a single metric, then you start getting into a really good handle for how do you start thinking about product development and strategy in different ways to drive development and growth in a given product. And then lastly, to close out, I think kind of like a fun exercise to always undertake is, force yourself to put yourselves in the shoes of a PM at a company, of a product that you use, and walk through that prioritization exercise. Just ask yourself like, hey, why? I think we've all been in this situation of like, hey, why hasn't company X done like XYZ? They have plenty of money, they have plenty of resources. Like this is a huge pain point for me as a user. Like I can't understand why they haven't done such and such. Sometimes there's a good reason for that. Sometimes there's not, obviously. Sometimes it's just like, hey, they're strapped and they didn't get to it or they didn't think of it. But oftentimes I think if you go kind of down the line of like, you think through like, hey, sometimes like the things that impact you or things that you care about a user don't align really neatly with the company's, priorities, or the impact, or they don't impact a business metric that company cares about. Then you'd be like, oh, okay, that makes sense why they didn't prioritize it. Sometimes like there is a positive business impact. There is a clear upside in the change, but actually it creates a trade-off in another metric that the company cares more about and they're not willing to accept that trade-off. So that's another interesting angle that you'll sometimes like start to explore when you think about like why hasn't company done XYZ yet. And then lastly, I think what's oftentimes very common is that there's a positive impact upside to be had with a given feature idea or proposal that you have, but it's not significant enough to justify actually prioritizing that investment. And so again, I think this is just like a really practical tip. Like I think everyone's been there where like they're using a product and like kind of frustrated, like, oh, like why haven't they done XYZ? Like that's a really good opportunity to take a step back and like force yourself to go through that same kind of business impact and prioritization exercise. And I think if you do that on a consistent basis, like you'll get a lot better at interviewing, you'll get a lot better at like thinking through how your own product roadmap or how you make decisions, like, developing a framework for how you make decisions about prioritizing products or in features. Whew, okay, cool. So that's kind of the main content of the presentation. At the end, there's some stuff I didn't have time to cover. I don't really have a lot I want to say, but communication obviously is a skill that comes up a lot when talking about product management skills. With that, I would just say like just practice writing, practice making decks, practice public speaking, kind of like I'm doing right now. That's also one of those skills I feel like you just get better as you do more of it. So just force yourself to do it as much as possible. Product strategy, I think people are always very interested in. I will do my typical shill thing and just say, hey, read Ben Thompson's Stratechery. I think if you read that every week or however often it comes out, you'll naturally develop better thinking around strategy. And then lastly, I think two things that come up quite a bit too, building better design sense and then building better technical skills. I would say those are, again, two things where like, hey, go practice mocking up your own product ideas and go learn to code if you feel like you're lacking in technical depth. Those are two things that I think are relatively straightforward in practice and to build skills on. So I didn't cover them in the scope of this presentation, but I wanted to call out those, like, again, like I said at the beginning, this presentation wasn't really meant to be comprehensive of all PM skills that you might want to build, but just wanted to give you at least some ideas on like, practical or concrete things you can do on a day-to-day basis to practice getting better at product thinking and to build those PM skills. So that's it. That's the end. I think I came in just under time, which is great. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen and hope you found this valuable.